Hi, everyone, and welcome to Practically Platonic again. Hi, Sylvia. How are you doing?
Hi there, I'm doing well.
That's good. So, in this chapter 3.1 in the Enneads by Plotinus, Plotinus talks about fate, and he covers three of his opponents' positions. So, the Epicureans, the Stoics, and the Astrologers. So, fate is something he has discussed in previous sections, although this is a chapter dedicated specifically to this topic. So, what was your feeling on this chapter, Sylvia?
I feel like he's making an well, I'm not feeling like he's making an argument. He is making an argument broadly against determinism, against absolute determinism, in favor of a position that is, I don't think he necessarily thinks fully total free will, insofar as humans being also embodied material beings, but certainly that it's a compromise or it's a mix between some level of determined fate in the material world, but that ultimately we can influence this because our rational soul, which is what allows us to make decisions within our life, is not bound by the rules of the material world. And he kind of goes through and argues against the points of the Stoics, the Epicureans, and the Astrologers, which we'll get into here in a minute. But I think ultimately I really liked this chapter, and I think it sounds, and it rings true even today, as this argument is not something that has been settled, right? Even if you take the concept of the metaphysical out of the picture, there are, as we discussed several episodes ago, scientific points of view in which there is a belief of absolute determinism, which the Epicureans, their point of view is by today's standards, like scientific. But I like that he expects us to have accountability for our actions, and the beauty of being able to be a free entity. And it also gives hope. Like, accountability doesn't just bring responsibility, but it brings hope, I think, as a
Right,
human
right.
being.
Right. And so as you're summarizing here, I'm also looking at what Plotinus wrote, and he says that, some are caused by the soul, others by causes in the world around us, that when souls act, whatever actions they do in accordance with right reason, they do of themselves when they do them. But since they are hindered in anything else they do, they are passive rather than active. And so when the soul is exercising reason, then that in itself is free will. That is not deterministic. But at the same time, too, he recognizes that there are externals and that we are compelled to experience them, react to them, and so forth. But then this is different from the Stoic position, which suggests that everything external to the will is, in fact, determined. One thing I thought that I had when reading this chapter too is that there's a concept of the soul, the world soul, at a higher metaphysical level. And so one might initially think that that sort of broad, cosmic, sort of over-enveloping soul might be cause for believing that everything is determined by one source. But then, based on Plotinus's cosmology and metaphysics, we know that the souls are descended. So there is the world soul, but at the level of the material world that we're operating, we have many souls that are simultaneously making decisions and thinking and exercising their free will, and that is not necessarily predictable either. So there's a sort of chaotic element in material reality that you maybe don't have at the level of even the cosmic level. So the ordering of
Right.
it's perfectly ordered and predictable, and that's fated. Whereas at the material world, because we have all of these different descended fragmented souls, there's a lot more chaos in the mix, and it's not necessarily predictable. So you can predict the motion of the planets, but you can't predict what sentient beings will do.
I guess that part did confuse me. I had made a note to myself where I thought, well, wait a second. I thought that he thought that that everything was one, but maybe I'm conflating concepts. So is he saying that we're not all part of and by we, I mean all of existence, all beings? Is he saying that we're not all part of the world soul, as I believe the Stoics are insinuating, but that we are all part or emanations fundamentally of the one, right? And that the world soul is at a lower level. So the world soul is not equivalent to the one, correct? Am I understanding that correctly?
World soul is a reflection, an image of the forms, which are image of the one. And as he said in
Right.
earlier chapters, everything that is an image of something else is an inferior form or an inferior version of what it
Correct.
reflects. So we have
So I guess my question is, our soul, is that part of the world soul? Because he says that previously, he states that we're each embodied souls, where the higher disembodied part of our soul seems to be part of some larger, not independent soul entity, right?
Right. So at the level of soul, at like the metaphysical level, there is a unity and a coherence to it. But then we are in our everyday lives, in our lived experience, in time and space, the descended souls. And so the descended souls are operating in a very different environment than at the level of the soul.
But to clarify, it's all the same. At the higher level, the world soul or the universal soul, and that higher level soul that we would undescended would be a part of is all. He's referring to the same soul. There's no differentiation of different soul. Correct? I just want to.
Yeah. At that higher level, it doesn't seem that there is a differentiation of souls. So we have descended souls,
Okay.
which means that I'm separate from you in the lived experience we have here on Earth in the material world. But if you trace it back to a higher level, then you have the undescended souls. Undescended soul, really, it's singular. It's not plural.
Right. So I guess to clarify the note I made for myself, because I think that's what I understood, and correct me if I'm wrong, but also to hopefully make this clear to others if it's the case, one could differentiate between his position on how that soul interacts and how the Stoics seem to see it, and that he doesn't think we're like simply, and I'm just using metaphors here, sort of like, we're not like just appendages, automata of the soul, right? We're not just like an octopus's, well, actually, that would be different. Actually, maybe we are more like octopus's limbs that are able to have separate thoughts in a sense, even though they are all part of one, versus, say, maybe the Stoics' idea that we're like all part of some centralized computer system and that each individual center isn't actually thinking on its own. It's all just appended, that basically that the world soul is really doing all of the thinking and and that we're not really individuals on any level, not even in this material world. It seems like is what they're saying, which kind of contradicts other parts of their theory to me. Well, but this isn't really about Stoicism.
Well, my sense of what Plotinus is suggesting here is that the Stoics believe that there's a singular reason, logos, that dictates everything in the universe. And the Stoics are operating at a material level because they're effectively materialists.
Right, but they believe that the logos also therefore dictates everything that they do. So how could they possibly choose to have the willpower to, not react to things? They kind of, and they also, like, the other part of what they bring up, which we haven't directly stated here, is, which I also think is interesting from the Stoics materialist view, is in line with a lot of modern ideas, is that everything is predetermined they believe everything was predetermined from an initial point of beginning of being, right? And that's kind of, I think, similar to the deterministic hypotheses around a possible Big Bang or whatever started everything, because that is certainly a philosophical question around astrophysics and physics now, which is, I think there's a parallel there between the thought process.
So the Stoics believe that humanity was endowed with a spark of the divine by Zeus.
Okay.
And that's what distinguishes us from most animals, is that we do have a sense of reason. And that reason allows us to either assent to predetermined immutable fate or get dragged along with it. And so in that sense, you do have free will as a human being. It's not that your will is, strictly speaking, determined by fate. It's just that everything you experience external to the will is in fact fated. And so as a result of that, you have the option of either assenting to it or fighting it. So there is free will there. But in Plotinus's universe, my sense is that there is obviously a design to everything, but then there's also this sort of chaotic element, because it's not just humans who are interacting with material reality. We have other organisms, and then we also have various divine beings as well, having their own input in everything. And so it's not that it's all part of a singular plan, but rather there's a lot more how do you say, multivariate variables.
So would not that I'm saying it's an apples for an apple to apple. What is this? What am I trying to say? They're not identical or yeah, maybe. What I'm trying to say, not maybe identical or synonymous, but would the Stoics' logos be similar to the universal soul or to the one?
I think it would be more like, for the Stoics, it's more of like the ultimate design that's unfolded by the demiurge.
So so they believe in more of a demiurge versus the Platonic concept of the one.
Well, Stoicism is in practice, it is, you can qualify it maybe as a monotheistic philosophy, but that's also problematic because the Stoics talk about the gods. But when you're reading Epictetus, for example, and the Stoics, they talk about basically the demiurge being responsible for creating the universe and setting it in motion, and everything that we experience is pre-planned, predetermined from the very inception of the universe.
So would it be more like the soul? I mean, I guess the difference here, you could say that in a sense, this form of Platonism is monotheistic, and the difference being that, if I'm understanding correctly, the Stoics believed in some sort of sentient initiating factor that then created everything to include the gods, whereas the one, as explained by at least Plotinus, and it's the easiest way I can think of explaining it is something that's not sentient, almost like a natural force or a supernatural force. So not that it had a designed plan thinking through in the way you and I would think, but that things just happened. And then from that, he also, I think, entertains the creation of the gods and other beings that are maybe not material. So is that like the main differentiation? The I guess the type of Godhead to
Right. I mean, in some ways, you could also see the Stoic position of the demiurge as not being a literal god, but it seems to have more of a figurative function.
And I'm sure there's been different strains of Stoicism in different periods of time and in different areas. I'm sure it's not all just one thought process, right? Or one system that agrees in detail to every aspect. So, like, I guess then we come back to the question: what is the actual differentiation that he's arguing then? As you've like at least explained, it sounds like they do believe we have some level of free will but is that free will only extended to being able to, I guess, like an intellectual free will only in whether we choose to suffer in our fate or interact with it, or I guess more philosophically and more serenely or more stoically? Is that the only differentiation, I guess, versus he thinks, no, we can actually make different actual choices, like in events in the timeline, we can actually act differently. Whereas they think only intellectually do we have control. But everything, like you are, according to the Stoics, if you're going to walk outside tomorrow and step in front of a truck and be hit, there is nothing you can do to change that. The only difference could be how you then react to it emotionally or intellectually, say you survive and are severely injured, for example.
Well, the absolutist position of Stoicism is that you have absolutely no control over anything external to the will.
Okay, got it. So it's totally in your head what you have control over.
Internally, you can think through things, you can reason about things, but
if you can reason through things, why can't you act differently? Would be my argument to them. But I guess I guess I'm making Plotinus's argument to some, or I don't know if it's his argument, but an argument that I think he might make.
Well,
do you have an answer as a resident Stoic?
Well, there's an absolutist position, which in some sense you can take it as a metaphysical position, but you can also understand this as a mental exercise as well, where if you contemplate a reality that you have absolutely no control over, and that includes things like your health, that includes the well-being of other people, your finance, your country, everything, then there's really no reasonable way to become angry because you had no control over that. It's sort of like if you see another person wasting their money, it's their money and you don't normally get upset over this. And so it's the same thing where if you believe that everything is fated, then you have no actual legitimate reason to get upset over it because you can't do anything about it. So
but they're saying that we have the ability to think and exert willpower. I suppose you could make the argument then that even when you think you're making a choice, that was predetermined too, and even the illusion of choice is not truly a choice.
But in this sense, I don't think that when a Stoic is saying that everything absolutely is fated, I mean, they can make an ontological position or a theory of causality which posits this, that absolutely everything is fated from the very beginning. But it's more of a way of orienting the mind as well. And so if you orient your mind towards this,
Well, there's no point in orienting your mind that way, though, if you don't truly believe that's the case. What is the point of living your whole life in a certain lifestyle that is meant to mitigate the suffering of that alleged reality?
Because the result will be that you'll be much more at ease, and then when your mind is naturally at ease, you're more likely to behave in a virtuous way. One of the Stoic positions is that if you have a calm, very solid mind, then just as somebody who is in gentle spirits is very kind towards others and generous and accommodating, so too will you be kind and accommodating even in the worst of circumstances. So you can take it as like an absolutist position on a certain kind of causality, but you can also take it as a mental orientation. My position is that most of what we experience in reality, that includes our everyday experiences, the weather, the economy, everything, we don't really have much control over it, and we can observe
right, but we don't have control on it in the material sense too, not metaphysically necessarily. It's just
right, but
you know what I mean.
But I do believe that you do have the free will to exercise a certain amount of choice and decisions over how you orient your life.
Right.
Now, an absolutist position would be like the outcome is still going to be the same regardless of what you decide to do.
Yeah.
So you
yes, exactly.
But that's an absolutist position. I think most Stoics historically would have said, obviously, there's going to be a big difference.
But he's arguing the absolutist position right now.
Right, and philosophers inevitably have to speak in absolutist terms and not in
right. I mean, that's
what
how you can get to truth. You can't just either you don't know and you're making an assumption, or if you're going to assert something, you have to assert something specifically. But as far as the purpose of this chapter, he's talking about an absolutist point of view of the Stoics, correct? Right. Based on, and the differentiation isn't so much that he doesn't believe that there's some original causality. It's more that they think that they literally cannot, or like in this version, literally can't change anything. They can only mentally or intellectually choose to emotionally, mentally confront reality one way or the other, versus he says you can actually make different material choices.
Right.
I can choose to continue to be in, say, a bad relationship, or I can choose to get out of a bad relationship. I suppose the Stoic would argue that if you had the correct temperament and mental state to begin with, you probably wouldn't have ended up in that relationship. But then again, people are in those relationships, and I don't know. I find the Stoic argument, at least the absolute version, it gets a little tangly, because if you have some sort of intellectual willpower, you can act upon it. But anyways, we're not here to re-argue it. But that's what he's doing in this chapter, is arguing this, right? Even though his argument is a little different. What's his argument against them? Let's see. Oh, right. I guess we already covered it. I mean, his argument is that we can tangibly make changes in this material world because our soul controls our being, the living activities, and that our soul is partially undescended, therefore superior to the material manifestations of the universe and equivalent to the soul that, kind of has perpetuated everything, and ultimately also part of the one.
Well, it's also that the external material world also pressures and compels the soul as well.
Right. Yes. So there's all sorts of things. Yeah, he brings that up, that there's internal, and he emphasizes the importance of internal and external factors, both insofar as things that constrain you, but also things that allow choice or allow things to have, I guess, a level of chaos or not determinism.
And so this extends also into his criticism of the astrologers, who posit that all manner of experience in life, and even the personality of a person, their thought processes and their feelings, are somehow determined by the configurations of the planets and their movements throughout one's life.
I think we should pause here and re-highlight, at least my understanding is that, again, he's talking about a certain interpretation of astrology of his period, in which they're influencing factors, almost excuse me, almost like the humors are or whatever, not that I'm not conflating the two, but that is not just that they indicate things, but they're like almost like we would see in later in history, like natural science, that they're almost actually causing it in a way that might be explainable or maybe not explainable, but they are the actual cause of the actions.
The language in Hellenistic astrology and also the translated texts as well make it expressly clear that many believe that the planets cause people or make people into certain
Correct.
ways. And so generally there were two kind of approaches to this. There's that of Claudius Ptolemy, but he was an outlier and he believed that astrology was entirely a natural science. But
Right.
there was no personality to the planets. They're basically elemental, insentient, unconscious forces that affect things like the tides and the weather patterns, but then also affect people's personalities and even whole nations of people as well. And then there's
But almost in like a naturalistic way, some sort of like archaic way, we might think that our environment have effects on our behavior now, but just more extreme, I guess, right?
yeah, he framed it as a natural science. And then
Okay.
Figures like Dorotheus and Valens and others who see the planets not as elemental forces, but actually as sentient intelligences, which you can frame it. Sometimes it's framed as sort of like a signal that they're configured to signal certain things, but then the language can also be that they cause things. And that in a certain configuration, they make a person a certain way, so they cause them to do things, cause them to behave or think in a certain way, or to make certain decisions. And this is something that Plotinus is vehemently arguing against.
Right. And
it's
he's already argued this before in a previous chapter. I don't remember the title. I think it was in the first book.
Also because you have the perfect ordering of the superlunar sphere, so everything at the moon's level, the lunar level and above, that is all perfectly ordered and consistent. And so to propose that their motions would somehow cause misfortune or compel people toward certain activities, whether they will this or not, is highly problematic for Plotinus, because his cosmology doesn't really allow for this, because the superlunar spheres are basically perfectly ordered. They're in soul, but they're perfectly ordered.
Yeah, and we've already discussed this, and he gets way into it, and it was on whether or not the stars are the cause of things. Something like that was the name of the chapter. I think it's in the second book. On whether the stars are causes, it was section 2.2. But he does concede to some degree, again here, I think he says that the spheres and the heavens can have some level of influence on us. And I think it's interesting that he compares it to the way that any environmental, like a psychosocial environmental effect, because he says, just like our parents influence us, maybe partially, he doesn't say genetically, but like that's kind of what we would call it now, whether through our actual relation to them and therefore being similar to them in aspect and also in behavior, but also in learned behaviors. He alludes to that, and how basically our social environment influence us to some extent. Therefore, he would concede that perhaps the spheres influence us, but still being what he believes is the nature of the cosmos, and also again our rationality coming from, or our rationale coming from the soul, that we have choices. And that, I guess the difference is those things we are influenced, but the part that is influenced is the material body, and the more irrational aspect of us, the animal aspect of us, or the chaotic aspect of the material part of our being. But we still have willpower over choice through the rational aspect of our being, which is the soul.
Right. And based on what he says earlier in the book, he does believe that the stars can signal things, and that somebody in a right position can interpret those and to see how reality or the future will unfold. So in one sense, he doesn't have a problem with the idea that you can predict future outcomes based on the stars. But what he's arguing against specifically is that he doesn't like the idea that the planets are causal forces that compel people to do bad things, or planets have some sort of personality, and that in certain configurations they get upset with people and then cause them to experience all sorts of misfortunes. So because for his position, that's just untenable if the planetary spheres are perfectly ordered. And
I'm assuming in the original, or actually I think it is in the original order in which these books actually were, and perhaps in the way in which he may have given his lessons. This probably came before the other chapter that we've already covered on, which is pretty much very specific to astrology, right? Whereas this one's kind of seems like a summation of different schools of thought that he disagrees on this specific topic, and then on that one he gets, which we've already covered, he really gets into it as far as astrology, and as you're saying, his belief of what the nature of the spheres and the higher cosmos actually is, and why they wouldn't be nefarious. And yes, I remember covering them, like, why would they be interested in us any more than like a flock of geese? Like that, maybe he does concede, you might be able to get signals from this. It might signify something, but it's not purposeful from the point of view of the planets. It might be part of some other larger, perfect, unknown reason of the perfection of the design of reality, but it's not purposeful on the part of the planets or these god entities that as he sees them.
Well, from his position in that time period, it was already well understood how the moon affects the tides on Earth.
Right.
So from that perspective, you can make a empirical claim, testable,
right,
that at least one of the planets has a very obvious effect on the tides, and then obviously the motion of the sun relative to the seasons. So the other planets as well, presumably would also have some sort of effect. But again, assigning some sort of personalities to them, or
well, still, I don't think he's disagreeing with that, because he does say they may have some influence, but it's not they're not doing the thing with the intent of the result that might come out. So the moon, for whatever reason, is doing her thing. And one of the results is that it has an effect on our tides. But even in his own time, there was no empirical evidence or even anything that they could indicate, really, other than tenuous correlations, that there was actually an influence of when a certain planet was in a certain position. That's why you're an asshole? Like, no, probably not. Whereas the argument of the tide is something that was very verifiable and repeatable, correct? Well, and again, the differentiation being, it's not that these entities are doing it, they don't have humanity in mind. They're not doing things with us, these lower beings, in mind. They're just doing their own thing.
Well, one thing he brings up here is that astrologers claim that if you look at your wife's chart, you can predict your fate. If you look at the child's chart, you can predict the outcome of the future for the mother or the father. And so you have different predictions based on different people's charts about other people. But then there would be potentially contradictions here. And so he says, well, which horoscope is the cause of this? Now, I think if you look at
none of the he's twisting things, right? He's presenting it in a certain light, because he's not saying when Hellenic astrologers were not saying that the horoscope itself is causing anything. In fact, they would make the counter argument, allegedly, that you would be able to compare all of these charts and see the overlap of the same events. If you were to look at, like, my 7th house, maybe the events that transpire in that house would have some similarity with my partner's 1st house. They would make that argument.
Astrologers would also make the argument in this case, I think, that they're not talking about like absolute causality, but inclination.
Right. Right.
Certain configurations of the planets incline certain personalities and certain actions, certain events to unfold, but it's not like an absolute causal force. I kind of get the sense when Plotinus is talking about astrologers, he's setting up straw man arguments. And
there's always straw man arguments in most ancient philosophy. I also think that maybe I'm being too generous, but he's also like, these are not arguments that are addressed at the Stoics or addressed at the astrologers, but they're addressed to his students or other people willing to listen. And often, as you know, experts in an area, or rather people who learn about things but are not experts in an area, often don't quite grasp the topic correctly, or popular understanding of certain things may be distorted in such a way that even though the astrologers might make the argument we just discussed, the casual enthusiast or person who's like heard about it or is concerned about it might have a less nuanced understanding of it, and therefore might, lead their life in such a way to not have accountability or to have more fear around the topic, right? You see what I'm saying? And same, I guess, for the Stoics, people who are not actual Stoics and maybe people who were peripherally aware of this, but really hadn't read anything, kind of like the pop intellectualism of its own time, which I'm assuming many people who perhaps were not the lowest class, but maybe a merchant class and wealthy enough to at least have some level of learning, maybe know how to read a little, but they were not, dedicating their time fully to intellectual pursuits, but still had like a peripheral understanding of what was in the zeitgeist at the time. Then just like now, people like read an article online and then they're like, oh yeah, that's how this thing is.
Well,
right?
I'll tell you one thing from personal experience. Like, my background is in Buddhist studies, and there's been no shortage of times that I've talked about Buddhism with a lot of people, and a lot of people think that they're very well read on Buddhism, but what they've read are modern 20th or 21st century Western interpretations of Buddhism based on a select few sources. And then you have multiple generations of authors that have read the preceding generation and then just recycle the same ideas.
So they're just glosses, basically?
It's not even glosses, but it's basically like a form of literature that has become detached from the original tradition. It is still claiming to be Buddhism and representative of Buddhism, but it tends to just recycle very modernized, westernized ideas. So
you're talking about people you've talked about that are Westerners, I'm assuming, predominantly.
Well, my point is that, so if you're going to look at this as a scholar, you'd look at either what the living traditions have to say, or you go back to the original scriptures, the original text. Right. Ideally looking at them in the original languages, such as, Tibetan, Sanskrit, classical Chinese, and then telling me what the original religion suggests. So, but my point is that what is understood as Buddhism, particularly in the Western world, especially in the English-speaking world, is based on like a century of Western scholarship, which is very much detached from the living traditions, and even more so detached from the original ancient tradition and the scriptures that came with that. And so if you compare...
So they're just... And also there's so many different denominations, or whatever the correct term is, much like there is in Christianity.
Yes.
And I'm assuming a lot of people are maybe only acquainted with like the Western interpretation of one of these. I don't even know. What's the right term? I'm assuming denomination is not the right term, but...
Well, we use sect of Buddhism.
Sects, because there's two major branches, and then each of those have a multitude of different branches of thought process, I'm assuming, and from what you've told me, if I recall, like which texts were the ones that were focused on more. So it's not even necessarily that different sects like necessarily disagree. They're just more focused on different aspects of, or different sutras.
Right. And so as a result of that, you have representative opinions on Buddhism, which are based on this modern westernized lineage of exegesis.
I bet you these Westerners, whether or not they ever were actually practicing Christians or not, still grew up in a world of Christian denominations in which the rationale behind the branching off of different sects or denominations of Christianity is not because some were more focused on one book of the Bible versus another, but actual disagreements. So I think, I don't know because I don't study any of this at all, but I'm just trying to think it through as I know people to behave, that perhaps those who are more naive might even think that different sects of Buddhism are in contradiction simply because their concept of things branching off is from a divisive or a dispute point of view versus simply a focus on text point of view.
And it's also, I think, also the inherited tradition as well, based on what your teacher has told you, and what your community wants to believe and expects to believe. And so bringing this back to Plotinus, he's obviously speaking to a audience that's quite sympathetic to Plato. And so he has to represent the tradition and also to attack the opponents of the tradition and try to convince his students to,
well, of course,
the Platonic point of view, and specifically his point of view, rather than embracing Stoicism, Epicureanism, or astrology. And so,
well, that goes without saying. I'm just saying, why is he presenting things that are not actually perfectly in line with what, at least now, we think we know was the reality? And even there, in reality, we only have the text that we have. We don't know what was really going on in the streets. He may be, very likely he's misrepresenting them. Maybe he didn't really know as much as he thought he knew about this and had not done a significant amount of his own research. Or maybe there were varying types of schools. Maybe the more, I'm just pondering that maybe the more reputable, real astrologers were practicing in a way that is not consistent with what he's reporting, but your everyday in the streets, like astrologers and fortune tellers, maybe were behaving in a way that is more consistent with what he's attacking.
Well, he was, if I recall correctly, Plotinus was in Rome, so he would have had access to a diverse community of different people.
Right.
And different practitioners, so we can speculate. But in any case, it seems that this lecture is directed at a limited audience, and whether he
it's just people are showing up to his school.
Right, whether he faithfully represents his opponents or not isn't really of interest to the audience. And this wasn't written, or it doesn't appear to have been written as like a systematic treatise where he properly represents his opponent's positions, but rather he just wants to refute them and highlight the accuracy or the truth of the Platonic position according to him, which is what philosophers do anyway. It's quite common.
Right. I got to take a break to get my tea.
Okay, sure.
So I think I'll just see the silence.
Yeah, that's fine.
And then edit it out.
That's cool.
So the other group of people that he talks about are the Epicureans, which we mentioned, but we didn't really get into it, which I thought was also very interesting in light of the discussion we've had in a previous episode. I think maybe it was the one about astrology. I don't remember, where we talked about Robert Sapolsky's latest book and his idea that everything is predetermined in our behavior because of a very complex variety of neurochemical and biological things happening in us. Obviously, the Epicureans aren't quite, they're of their period, but it would seem to me almost like a simplistic and ancient approach to kind of that idea of a materialistic, scientific, quote unquote, idea in which they think that all of our behaviors are determined by the atoms and the atoms in the universe and how they interact, and the atoms that make up our actual body, us, and how they interact. And he talks about atoms going up or down or right or left, which I thought was kind of funny. But even though that's a super simplistic initial notion of what is actually causing us to behave as physical animals and what the material world is made out of, I think if you can tease out of that the future perception of things as we see them today, right? I think that basically his argument against them is well, even if these things influence us to some degree in the material world, or the material the image of the universal soul, which is the cosmos and the world and the planet as we perceive it, we still have free will, because again, our rational soul is superior to these atoms, which would be part of the material, which are just material fundamentally.
Well, I've
Did you understand it differently?
No, I mean that makes sense. Your explanation of it. My sense though is full-on determinism has always struck me as, personally speaking, peculiar, because every morning when you make up, you can make a decision to stay in bed or to get out of bed, or you can decide to eat one thing or eat another thing, or to drink tea or to not drink tea, etc.
Well, the argument can also be that you think you're making a decision, but that was predetermined too, even the moment in which you're thinking. I mean, I'm not a determinist, but to play devil's advocate, even the perception, you could make the argument that we may be living the illusion of thinking we have a choice, but we were always going to make that choice. We were always going to ponder it and then make a decision.
But if that's true, then there's a few select individuals in the history of the universe, human beings, who, by virtue of some sort of deterministic force, fully understand that everything is predetermined. And
right.
So it was predetermined that they would understand know that things are predetermined, and they're just also coasting along. But they're just one of the privileged elites of time and space who actually understand this.
Well, I don't see that as an argument against determinism, because they're still controlled by determinism as much as I see what you're saying, in the sense that then one would have to go and look at these individuals if, by stating that they were aware, or at least in their own community, the first to realize this, if they then took that to gain further power as being actually an elite, or if not, and just because some people were determined to make this realization, I'm sure they would argue that was all obviously predetermined, and depending on which philosophy or theology it's coming from, because there's determinism in so many different religions and
And
philosophies.
but then whether I care what they say or not is also already predetermined. So it becomes
Right.
it becomes kind of like an uninteresting discussion at that point.
Yes. The determinist argument I'm more familiar with is really determinism in the Reformation, but and in the late Middle Ages, but we're not going to go to where they like kind of like make some arguments to clarify that. They don't really stand up, in my opinion, but I mean, I agree with you.
I mean, in my
The point would be, go ahead, sorry.
my point, my personal point of view is that we do have free will, but it is a spectrum. There are some things over which we do have a great deal of control, and you can even train yourself to have more free will than you did before through self-discipline. But then there's also a certain amount of things, even internally in our psychology, which is to some extent deterministic. And for example, we do have our genes, our instincts, our mammalian instincts that are guiding us towards certain actions. And then even under certain physiological strains, we tend to lose free will. So if you're desperately hungry, then you might eat something you otherwise wouldn't eat. And similarly, like if you're desperately thirsty, or if you're feel yourself to be in a great sense of danger, then kind of deterministic instincts can take over, and then your free will is suspended. Like there's kind of an expression where it's like blackout angry, where basically you lose all sense of self-control and your anger takes over, and then you do something extremely violent and unfortunate. And so that's an example of that. But in ordinary life, I do believe that free will is present, and it is, but it's a spectrum. And then you also have to contend with environmental realities as well, and also social realities where you don't have, I mean, I'm not powerful enough that I can control the outcome of stock trading and interest rates and all those sort of things.
Some people are, maybe.
Some people are, if you're that powerful. But in general, if you accept that you also have enough free will that you can exercise virtue in life, meaning you can be a good person, you can follow the truth, you can not lie, you can be kind and compassionate toward others, then you can also make the case that even in the face of adversity, that you do have the free will to continue to be a good person.
Right.
And that ultimately it is in your best interests to be a good person rather than the opposite. And so there's a sort of moral lesson I think you can take away from it.
Exactly. You got to it before I did, but I was going to ask you, ultimately, especially in the context maybe of the period in which Plotinus was living and the decades preceding him, everything that was going on, beyond just discussing whether or not we have fate, I mean, whether or not fate is within our control at all or not, ultimately, what is the relevance of that, not intellectually, but ethically? And I think that under that, I'm sure at some other point in the book he discusses it, but I think the real unspoken, he's just preparing for an argument that's unspoken here, but what is the behavior of a person who chooses to act as if they do have free will? And what are the psychological implications of believing you have free will versus believing you have no free will? And what effect does that have on an individual and on a society and on a group of people? And especially in periods of crises, which I believe he was speaking to people who were either going through, or it was certainly a time of turmoil, a time of a lot of cultural, religious, economic changes and upheavals. So there's definitely that. Like, what are the implications of believing you are accountable to some degree or not, and how that affects you psychologically and a whole group of people? The other question I wanted to ask then was, that aside, let us ponder a reality where there is, I guess, let's say that there is not a completely materialistic, atheistic reality, but some other reality that may entertain either a sentient or a non-sentient Godhead of some sort, or that there is some sort of quote unquote divine order to things. What would you say are two arguments for, like, well, what's the point of things being completely predetermined versus what's the point of things being not completely predetermined? I don't know if you have your own thoughts on that or any answers people have put forth in the past, but I think that is an interesting question to ask, to see if there's any rationale that even us mere humans could could start approaching. Of course, one could argue that we could never understand the reasons of a god, a sentient god, or whatever. But I guess from our perspective, what might be some rationale for one versus the other? Why would a godhead go? I guess I'm asking, why would God do one thing versus another, or a godhead? What is like? What would be?
You could look at it kind of in the same way that our circulatory system doesn't necessarily have a will; it just performs in order to keep the system running.
But everything's not determined. I mean, there's a system that works, right? And then exterior. But in this reality, there's nothing exterior to the one and the soul. So there's nothing else to influence it. But so I'm not saying how does it function. I'm saying what would be the point? Why would reality exist in such a way that it's totally deterministic? What's the point of everything being predetermined? Like, what if you know of anybody, like any philosopher or school of thought's argument for that? Or if you have any thoughts yourself, why one might think that. And then the inverse, what would be the reason for things to not be predetermined? Why give us free will? What's the point? What's the point? People can leave their opinions in the comments.
I guess the latter question, I wonder. Well, I mean, from Plotinus's point of view, we have these descended souls that we are embodied in flesh and blood, and it's a poor image of something higher. And so by virtue of that, you have a reality that is disorderly and fragmented, but it's still an image of the forms, but it is an inferior version of it. And so just by virtue, out of necessity, that's that's the necessary expression of it. Because if we were
by necessity it evolved or devolved, however you choose to look at it, into material forms, amongst which there are also us, embodied parts of the soul, and then there is space, at least in Platonic thought in general, that there might be reincarnation, and maybe even reincarnation until we reach the point in which we return, or everything then returns to a higher level, right? And so, as you were saying, I guess your point being, it's just a natural. The reason that things might be not predetermined is just the necessity of that's just how it turned out that we.
What comes to mind is this idea that everything is looking back. So the intelligible realm is looking back at the one, the soul is looking back at the forms, the intelligible, and then the embodied flesh and blood beings also are trying to look back at the soul and to the intelligible realm and the one. And so if we didn't have free will, then we wouldn't have the ability to look back, and we would just basically either be organisms on complete autopilot, or we wouldn't have sentient organisms or organisms at all.
Right. So it's just out of necessity.
What would be the material world could otherwise just be, immutable, stationary, unthinking.
Well, we wouldn't be right, because we wouldn't be, if we have no free will, we wouldn't be embodied souls, because the soul, in his argument, is not an automata. It is thinking. It has will.
Right, because the soul is thinking of the forms.
Right.
And the soul is also the desire for the forms, and one of the expressions of that is the material world, which embodies. And the question, and the question someone might ask of, why are we here? What's the point of us having free will? Goes back to what we've already described of the necessity of the emanation, eventually resulting into the material and embodied material, not material beings, but beings embodied in material. And then the circular nature potentially of that, as we make choices in each potential iteration of our material lives, we become wiser or more good and get closer and closer to the good, until perhaps in some versions of Platonisms, we universally or individually return to the one, and maybe the cycle starts all over again. I don't know. But yeah, it's almost more of a necessity, or as we might think of it now, I guess metaphysical, but also just the physics of reality, that's just how it works. And that's why there's some level of free will. I guess why everything would be predetermined, I don't know. I guess you could make the inverse argument of that too, but at that point you would have to change a lot of, those ideas usually come from a very different dynamic, where it's not that we are all actually part of one world soul or one soul, and we're not all part of emanations from the one, because at least in Christianity, humanity and this world is very distinctly separate from their God. It's not kind of in it like it is in
Neoplatonism. So,
Hmm.
well, I mean, I agree with you, and we've discussed this before. My feeling and my thought process is that it's not fully one or the other. Is that we live in a reality where we have some level of control, even we have a margin of movement and choice.
And I guess just as my final thought on this is, when we look at the practice of magic in the medieval period, there is this idea that you can exercise your own influence over fate. Now, they say that is free will, but there's a lot of things that we have to experience, and much of reality we don't have any control over. But you can use magic to start affecting your fate individually, or potentially the fates of others, through using various means. I mean, astral magic based on Picatrix, also known as Gayat al-Hakim in Arabic, is a form of astral magic, and you basically compel the spirits of the planetary hierarchies to do your bidding, or you create talismans which basically capture a specific planetary influence that you can use to enhance certain parts of your life. For example, Saturn for longevity, Venus for, various sorts of romantic energies and attraction, that sort of thing. So there is, in that sense, a way to manipulate fate beyond just, enhancing your own sense of self-awareness and your own.
Potentially. Maybe
Yeah.
that was always predetermined too. Maybe
Maybe that
not.
was predetermined too, right? But
That certainly explains, though, why the Christians and why this was seen as so taboo and illegal and the work of Satan, because if you're coming from a possibly deterministic or more deterministic than not idea of reality, to be doing things like this is to try to mess with God, with what is not something for you to mess with. It's God's decision. And then fundamentally, I guess, similar to like doing, I guess that's why it's Satan's work, much like the Abrahamic or the Christian. Satan was one who didn't want to follow the divine order of things. People who practice these things are, I guess, opening themselves up to basically rebelling against God's plan from obviously a Christian, mostly Christian point of view.
I suppose, though, from a polytheistic point of view, you have to look at fate as being not of a single design, but there's multiple competing influences, and sometimes they contradict each other, which is kind of interesting to think about as well. So even from a Platonic...
Well, it depends which kind of polytheism. I mean, the Romans, I only know much about the Romans, and they were not, more for political reasons, but they were against magic, and they were against most forms of private divination. They were against private divination. It was only something to be done in a very specific manner by the state for matters of the state.
Well, I know. I mean, I remember reading about how when the Romans took over Egypt, they tried to put an end to a lot of the magic, or at least they tried to contain it and control it. Also,
they saw it as superstition.
Well, they also potentially saw it as a subversive threat as well. And I'm sure plenty of Romans also believed that it was possible for these ancient clerics, these priests, to potentially put curses on them. So they wanted to keep that art or that technology under wraps.
Right.
They could.
They didn't want them interacting with their gods or their higher beings in a manner to I guess, negatively to undermine the Roman gods or the gods that the Romans had gotten to on their side of the fence. Because there's plenty of gods that weren't certainly not Roman, right? They would do propitiatory things, be like, we're gonna win this battle. You better come with us. Basically, is what they were saying. Like the Magna Mater was not an originally Roman goddess, but she was taken. The main statue was taken to Rome, and these things were done usually, at the same time in which they would overtake a city or a nation. They would also take their gods.
If you think about it from like a Roman point of view, imagine you're a Roman and you have a view of the gods presiding over reality and the land and people and so forth, and then you find yourself as a governor or controlling Egypt, and they have a very different pantheon, a very different language, priesthoods, and everything like that. So you're basically, even if you respect their gods, you still also have your own pantheon to contend with.
Well, I think that they believed in, I think it's a bit more nuanced. It's not, half the time I don't think they even actually thought they were different gods. They were, I think, intelligent enough to realize that societies develop and recognize different powers of nature or powers of reality and just give them different names and represent them differently with what's consistent with their own surroundings. I think that's often why in ancient text there's like really the incorrect name where it'll say Zeus or Jupiter or something, and in reality that god had probably some completely different name. In like different areas of the Middle East or other parts of Asia which they entered, they would just be like, oh, this is like their version of XYZ.
Well, that's
and then there's also Then there's also local deities, which they believe that there was so many local deities and cultural and the protectors of specific civilizations.
Well, one of the prime examples where the gods were equated across different pantheons is the planets. So what we call Jupiter in Babylonia was Marduk, and then in Persia was Ahura Mazda. So Mars, Aries, Nergal, what is it? Thoth, Nabu, Mercury, Hermes. So you have so basically when they were categorizing the planets based on deities, which was originally done in Mesopotamia, they saw them more or less as parallel or equatable deities, which is interesting.
I'm assuming that they had also similar characteristics across these cultures, or perhaps not.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you have a god of writing, then
Well, I mean, specifically the planets, I guess, is what I'm asking about. Like, did the planet Mars, as we know it to be, did it have the same characteristics? I guess we'd have to compare two civilizations that came to be more or less at the same time and existed at the same time, because if we were to compare the Romans with the ancient Babylonians, I don't think that's a fair comparison, because clearly the one influenced other cultures that ultimately also influenced the development of Roman religion later. So I don't think it would be quite fair to see if, oh, look, these guys and these guys came up with the same conclusions, when in reality one came up with this stuff so much earlier and eventually influenced the other, indirectly or directly.
Systematic knowledge of the planets arises in Mesopotamia, and then it spreads to neighboring cultures. And then the custom of naming the planets after gods also goes back to Mesopotamia. So for the Greeks, they were basically just following a Mesopotamian precedent, and then the Romans got the idea from the Greeks.
I guess a comparison between Far East Asia and I guess Mediterranean astrological cultures is more interesting, because there's less, I might be totally wrong, but less chance, at least at certain points in the history, of influence.
Well,
I know that a lot of your work actually talks about those overlaps, but I guess it depends on in what period.
Well, in ancient China, Venus was the metal star, and Venus governed soldiers in war, not Mars.
Interesting. Yeah.
Whereas Venus is Aphrodite in the Greek.
Totally different in the West.
Right. But then to complicate matters, Mesopotamia, it was Ishtar, who's a war goddess, who's also a goddess of merrymaking and pleasure as well. So it gets rather interesting when you make these comparisons.
And we don't know, there's also cultural reasons people may change things. I can't imagine the Romans and the Greeks having a war goddess that is also a goddess of merrymaking. If you're gonna be a goddess that is interesting at all, or not interesting, that's not fair to the other ones, but that is in any way, I guess, dominant in personality, like Athena. The other side of that is that she was a virgin. God forbid a woman be strong and also sexual. You can only, that's kind of the trade-off, is purity as the only reason you would be listened to on a public level, right? Versus the goddesses of the hearth or goddesses of maternity and children, things that are within the sphere of men. The few times that women are listened to, such as either in myth or in reality, much like the oracles, I don't know if they were virgins. I don't know if the oracles were virgins. I would assume they would be expected to be, but
I'm thinking
they were priestesses.
Virgins, but I'm not sure if the Greek oracles were expected to be virgins.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know either. Of course, much like most of history until very recently, whenever did anyone listen to women unless they were saying, "Oh yeah, God told me to do this." That's also true of Christian mysticism. Anyways, I think you and I all have very similar ideas on the nature of our fate. Anyways, but I'd love to hear what other people have to say about it in the comments. And if anyone can answer my questions, why do you think, what would be the point of a deterministic reality?
Okay.
I'm really curious what people think about that.
I look forward to reading the comments as well. So if anybody has any additional input or ideas, please leave it in the comments below. Okay. Well,
All right.
thank you very much.
Take care.